All right. So, hi, my name is Zapata. I'm one of the district wetland ecologists with the state of Vermont Wetlands Program. And I was invited here by the Monkton Conservation Commission to talk about wetlands because there are a lot of questions about and a lot of information to know about wetlands. And many people have thoughts about, things like, if I have land that I want to develop further, if I want to build a garage or expand my house, or I'd like a pond, how does that dovetail with wetlands? Right now with the housing market, you want to sell your undeveloped lot, or you want to subdivide off your property. Maybe you're thinking about buying land to build a new house or convert into farmland. Folks that have wetlands on their property, how do you set up for a successful sale of that property? Also, I'm going to kind of just review how you can avoid potential violations, or if you're looking to buy land that the land that you buy, you're actually going to be able to do what you want, on it or with it. And then just in general, like why does Vermont protect wetlands anyway? I'm going to intersperse this slideshow with some fun facts just about wetlands, and then hopefully you'll recognize some of the imagery throughout the presentation of wetlands that are found in Monkton. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what an actual wetland is, it's when three things come together simultaneously. First, you have to have water. And that can be a high groundwater table, or it could be surface water like shown here with Frodo and the hobbits. Once you have enough water in a place, then that changes your soil compositions to wetland soils. And then when you have water and soils, it produces your wetland vegetation. So when we talk about wetland hydrology, in Vermont, it means that an area is inundated or saturated within the soil surface for at least 5% of the growing season in most years. That equates to about 2 weeks during the growing season in Vermont. So if you have that area in your back lawn that's wet for 2 weeks, then chances are it may meet the criteria for wetland. So we're looking at things like surface waters, soil saturation, a high groundwater table. If you dig a hole in the ground, does it fill with water? Or if you're looking at maps, clearly you can see where those wet areas are. But you can also have less observable aspects of hydrology. Like, do you have areas where you have stunted or stressed plants? Where on the landscape would you expect water to concentrate? Can you see your drainage patterns of where your water flows across the landscape? Once you have the water, if that water is there long enough, it forces oxygen out of the soil, and you have decomposition in the absence of oxygen. And that changes your chemical, your biological, and your physical characteristics of your soil. So wetland soils that are mineral soils typically will turn gray, and you may see evidence of what appears to be rust. Soils that have a high organic matter will turn dark, almost black, and sometimes they feel very oily. So there are numerous wetland types in Vermont. All of these are present in our landscape. You have our forested swamps, your scrub-shrub wetlands, emergent wet marshes or your soft-stemmed plants, bogs and fens, which are specialized, your seeps, like your hillside seeps where water seeps out of the ground, vernal pools, which at this time of the year we're gearing up for, wet meadows. Many of our hayfields may qualify as wetlands in this wet meadow condition. And going back to this all comes back to your vegetative community. So you have water, you have soils, and then you have your vegetation. And we will return to this again. So fun fact, wetlands host about 31% of all of the world's plants. And in Vermont, that percentage is even higher. supporting about 50% of Vermont's plant species, so a really high diversity. So for the wetland program, our task or our responsibility is that we have no net loss of wetlands in Vermont, and that we're protecting the functions and values that the wetlands are providing on the landscape, and that overall we're meeting our water quality standards. And so not only does the state of Vermont protect wetlands that meet certain criteria, but we also protect an upland buffer around that, and typically that is 50 feet. Currently, wetlands compose approximately 5% of Vermont's landmass, even though in some locations it might feel like a lot more. So jurisdictional wetlands. I chose this because it's a vernal pool, and it's that time of year. And so the state of Vermont regulates wetlands under the Vermont wetland rules for those that are deemed significant enough to be protected based on evaluation of their functions and values. And so those functions and values, there are 10 that have been identified for being worthy of protection. And you can see here it ranges from your flood storage and water quality to all of your habitat components for fish, wildlife, rare, threatened, endangered species, those exemplary natural communities that are uncommon, and then just for fun, our education and research, recreational opportunities. Sometimes they're just beautiful open spaces. Sometimes they're the only green space because they can't be developed. And then erosion control, especially along our lakes and streams. So I try to keep our presentations light and a little humor thrown in. And this sort of sums up what functions and values do on our landscape. Basically, they act like sponges. They filter out pollutants. They store water. They help mitigate and offset drought conditions, as well as receive flood and storm waters to help mitigate flooding risk as well. And back to this fun fact. Because we have a frog concert going on in this cartoon, all of our Vermont frogs and toads rely on wetlands for at least part of their life cycle. So wetlands are classified in Vermont into class 1, 2, and 3, and that's based on an evaluation of those functions and values we just reviewed. So our class 1 wetlands, they're considered exemplary or irreplaceable. All of them are mapped. We'll talk about mapping in a little while. But a couple of examples would be Tinmouth Channel, Dorset Marsh, up in Ripton, Beaver Meadows. Further north, there's the Lake Shore in Burlington, or North Shore in Burlington. But there's very specific reasons for why they're being protected. Now, most of our wetlands on the landscape are class 2. And again, we'll talk about mapping a little later, but most of them are mapped, but not all of them are. However, we'll go through a checklist where if certain conditions exist, you should presume or assume that they are class 2 wetlands and protected. There are a few wetlands where, based on their size or their overall function and value, being not significant for any one of those 10, that would not be regulated by the state. However, caveat, even if they're not regulated by the state, they may still be regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers or your local zoning. So coming back to those wetlands that you should assume and presume that they are regulated by the state. Any that are already mapped, and here's an example of our map. It comes off of the mapping program, the ANR Atlas, or the Wetland Inventory Atlas. Any wetland that is connected or contiguous to these mapped wetlands, you should assume that they are also regulated. And then any wetland that is the same type and size that are shown here. Typically, it's a half acre or larger. If your wetland is a half acre or larger, you should assume that they are regulated. But we also have wetlands that may not be mapped. So for any wetland that is adjacent to a stream, lake, pond, or river, assume that they are regulated because of things like fish habitat, water quality, erosion control. Our headwater wetlands, which are those above 2,500 feet in elevation. Our vernal pools, we return back to that theme. And then our special or unique wetlands like those bogs and fens, which can be much smaller than a half acre, but are really specialized in the plant species that they contain. So coming back to the maps, once again, you can find these maps on our Wetland Inventory Mapping Program or the ANR Atlas. But the disclaimer here is really important, is that they are notoriously not accurate. Depending on where you are in Vermont, there may be 39 to 40% of wetlands that are not mapped, but could still meet those presumptions of protection. Right now, currently, we are in the process of updating our mapping. Most of this mapping that you're seeing is back from the 1970s. So our maps were only as good as the tools that they had at the time. We're in the process of updating those with our current tools and technologies. There will be a mapping update in April. That'll be statewide. In July, August of this year, the Greater Otter Creek Watershed, which Monkton is certainly part of, will also be updated. And then again in fall, we'll have a third update. And lastly, we just got approved for grant funding for the mapping of the Connecticut River watershed, which basically is the whole eastern half of Vermont. So over the next 5 years, we're really hoping to provide robust and more accurate mapping so that people have a better visual accuracy of where potential wetlands might be. They're on the ground. We're not magically just putting them there, but we're hoping to give you a visual as to where they might be so that you can be making some better decisions or asking better questions around wetlands that might be happening on your property. And so here we are, Monkton. As you can see, this is just a blowed up version. So starting over here to the far left, this is the pink is Cedar Lake or Monkton Pond. So this is the intersection, the school is basically right underneath the arrow. And when you're zoomed way out, you kind of get a sense as to where wetlands are on the map. But then when you start zooming in, all of this pink material pops up. That's actually a hydric soil layer, which are by definition poorly drained. And that means that they have a higher likelihood of supporting wetlands. And then each one of these stars means that there's been some type of review by my program about something there. That could be a proposed project, that could be a violation, that could be general inquiry of, do I have wetlands on my land? And so as you can see, even though it doesn't look like there's wetlands all over the place, each one of these stars represents some type of an evaluation, and I have some information at that spot if you ever need to know it. So as we talked about the fact that we regulate our wetlands, we also regulate that jurisdictional buffer zone of 50 feet for Class 2 wetlands. And the reason for that is the buffers filter out nutrients, prevent erosion, help protect water quality, provides additional wildlife habitat, and stops things like the spread of invasives or other disturbances like light, noise, or our pets, pollution entering into the wetland. So this just gives you an example of, where the wetland would be, how the 50-foot buffer would be applied. You can see that the hydric soils, supported the wetland formation in that area. and how close development can be against our wetlands. And so as a landowner, we now have a new tool, and this is a very wordy slide. Suffice to say, up here in the top, the wetland screening tool is at this link, and you can click on it, and all you need to get started is a 911 address or the span number for an undeveloped property. There's even a YouTube video that you can watch. But when you open this link, this page will pop up. You would type in your address here, and when you do, it will, the program is looking at all of those things that might be a red flag for wetland presence. It might be mapped wetlands, it might be surface waters, it might be your hydric soils. It'll be looking for those project stars to see whether or not there's been some type of review. And then it will spit you out a result. And then you can click on each one of them and it'll open up and it'll describe what's going on there. And this hopefully will give you some more information to say, oh, maybe I should call up Zap, and that would be me, to find out if I can do my project with or without a wetland permit. This will also help you produce a map. So there's just a variety of different things that you can do with the simple wetland screening tool up above. Okay, so summary. State rules. Class 1 and Class 2 protected by the state. A permit may be issued for activities within the wetland or their buffers. And this happens regardless of zoning. We're going to talk about zoning here in a little bit. So now local regulations can increase those wetlands or buffer protections through your own town language. So this is important. We'll talk about Monkton specifically, but also if you're thinking about moving to another town, being aware of local zoning is important. And here's why. UVM, I've been working with UVM students to compile all town zoning in a current Excel spreadsheet, and they looked at 3 case studies. So the case studies will include a town with no local zoning, some, and then a lot. So Williamstown, they have no local zoning bylaws around wetlands, but that means that all residents of the town are required to abide by the state and federal wetland laws. And so in this case, if you remember earlier in the slide show, Class 3 wetlands are not protected by the state, which means you could conceivably fill those in completely without a wetland permit, and they could just disappear off the landscape. Whereas Class 2 wetlands would be protected, and if you're proposing an activity, you might need a wetland permit. Jericho, on the other hand, if you were going to move to Jericho, they have increased protections. So they do specifically protect their Class 3 wetlands with a buffer of 25-foot recommended. They specifically call out vernal pools to protect them with a 100 to 600-foot buffers. Now, some of this may also be dependent upon what district you live in. Are you in a commercial district? Are you in a residential district? Are you in the rural or conservation district? Now, Jericho had some very specific conservation strategies. And so they have certain things that that their residents have to do or demonstrate. So even if the state of Vermont can issue a permit, sometimes local zoning can be more restrictive, and you may not have that same project approved at the local level. So that's important. Now, South Burlington has a ton of local zoning. It's very nuanced. Again, it comes back down to the districts that you live in, but you can see that they increase the buffer zones around wetlands. They do provide protection for the Class 3 wetlands if those Class 3 wetlands are at least 300 square feet in size. And they say that all wetlands, regardless of state classification or whether they're identified on the map, they shall have a minimum distance of 50-foot buffer. So once again, the state could issue a permit, but your local zoning may not support that same project. And they went on to become even more specific about special protections, fencing and landscaping, and standards like roadways and the requirements of mitigation efforts. So what does that mean? Boiled down, it's this slide. We have 3 towns. One has no local zoning. Jericho has some. South Burlington has a lot. We have a class 1 wetland here, a class 2 down below, a class 3 here, and a vernal pool, and that's duplicated on all of the properties. In Jericho, they maintain the exact same buffers that the state requires, and you could fill in the class 3 wetland without a state permit. In Jericho, they kept the same buffer for the class 1 wetland, same for the class 2 wetland. They increased the vernal pool to 100 to 600 feet, and they do protect the class 3s with a 25-foot buffer. And then when you get into South Burlington, those buffer sizes increased even more. So what does that mean for Monkton? For Monkton, you currently have no additional local zoning around wetlands primarily, meaning that the default is your residents must comply with the state rules and regulations, with the exception of the conservation district. So in this area, those areas that are unsuitable for development due to the topographical, soil, or wetland conditions, the use on those lands is limited to agriculture, forestry, outdoor recreation, and wildlife refuge. The state does not supersede or trump local zoning. So even if someone within these districts came in and wanted to propose a project and the state could permit it, you still need to ensure that if you live in one of these districts, that it can be approved locally. So in short, municipalities can create zoning requirements, specific zoning requirements to protect wetlands. This can be specific around subdivisions and planned unit development. For Ripton, they specifically were calling this out because they wanted to protect wetlands and wildlife and basically maintain a town's general rural character. And then for wetlands, they specifically outlined the things that could not be supported, such as septic systems or hazardous conditions. In Shrewsbury, they defined what a surface water and wetland was, and then they said that all wetlands, regardless of wetland classification at the state, are going to be protected by 100 feet. So once again, they also referenced it back to those functions and values: water quality, groundwater protection, flood and erosion control, the protection of flora and fauna, i.e. wildlife habitat, to provide for education and recreation. Oops, sorry. And so they were tying all of that into their zoning language or to support the zoning bylaw. So if the state could issue a permit in Shrewsbury, if it's within 100 feet of a wetland, within 100 feet of a wetland, you need to ensure that you have local zoning approval first before you come into the state. So fun fact, even though wetlands occupy only about 3.5% of the land area in the United States, 43% of our RTE species rely on wetlands for survival. In addition, more than 1/3 of North American bird species use wetlands for some aspect of their life or life cycle, and that 80% of those birds that are rare or threatened or endangered rely upon wetlands. So back to UVM, continuing to work with the UVM students, like I said, they are putting together a comprehensive Excel document. This is the last semester to finalize this project, and then we will make it publicly available. But they were detailing, does a town have increased wetland buffers or setbacks? Do towns specifically call out special protections, or are there special circumstances for different wetland zoning? Like you need to remain, if you are going to put in a gas station, you have to be at least 100 feet away from a wetland. We also thought it was important to identify if the town had any other water-related regulations, setbacks from streams or shore edges, etc. And so once they got all that information, they said, well, so what does that mean? Because let's just say this is pretty wordy and boring. And so what they did is they went back through and they started to numerically quantify those columns. And so at the very bottom, the criteria down here is that for each one of these columns, if the town is providing one of those in local zoning, they would be scored a point. So in the town of Jericho, where they have an increased buffer size for class 2 wetland, it would be scored 1 point. If they also gave class 3 protection, they would get another point, and so on. And so for the Williamstown and Jericho, South Burlington example, this is what it looked like. So Williamstown had no additional zoning. They ended up scoring a 0, whereas Jericho had more, scored a 3, and South Burlington even more. So what do those numbers mean, or how do we make it palatable to the public to understand it? And so they've developed a map. And basically there's no, so this isn't comprehensive. We're on the last semester. They just finalized the last 75 towns. In Monkton here is where the orange arrows are, meaning that right now it's just primarily state regulations only. And then there's a gradation so that you as a landowner can have a quick visual as to what a town might have around wetland regulations. Then you can go into the very boring zoning bylaw document and look up the specifics. So one of the things that's been coming up recently, especially with the housing market, is subdivisions. I want to subdivide my land. I want my daughter or my son to be able to build next to me. I have 100 acres and we need to retire, so we're going to make 4 building lots. Subdivisions are interesting projects because there's usually a lot of moving parts. So they can cover large parcels of land. Often, the larger the land area, the more likely a wetland might be on that land. Therefore, your lot size matters. And there's a lot of supporting infrastructure that's required for a subdivision to be viable, depending on, obviously, its size. If you're just going to be building the mother-in-law house next door, probably not so much. But if you're getting into that 4 to 10 or larger subdivisions, these are the types of things that need to be taken into consideration as part of the design process. You know, where are your utility right-of-ways? Are you going to be hooking into municipal water, or are you going to have to identify where your wells are going to go? Where is your stormwater being developed? How is your wastewater being handled? Are you going to incorporate your recreational paths or your green spaces? Do you need to have sidewalks? For some towns, a second entrance for emergency vehicles is required. And if you're having condos or apartment buildings, you also need to have enough adequate parking. So a lot of stuff starts to come into the design process. So this beautiful green screen, what can you do with it? Well, the reality is you have a landscape that looks like this. And I think we all know what these look like. In the Champlain Valley of Vermont. And then the farmer, unfortunately, or maybe not, maybe they're going to retire and go to Cancun or something, but they want to subdivide and have their retirement nest egg. This would be the traditional subdivision design. And if there's wetlands in and around these areas, then you may find that you actually can't develop some of those lots the way they currently are. And you have a lot of infrastructure and long driveways and not a lot of screening. So as a town or as a property owner, you can be thinking critically about how that subdivision is going to look. And instead, it could be something like this, where you have consolidated development. And what this means, it opens up a variety of other opportunities. So consequently, the remaining land, this portion up here, which is now still quite a large area, means that it could be rented or sold back to the farmer. It may be large enough to be enrolled in the current use program, reducing tax burden. It could be sold or entered into a conservation easement or enrolled with a land trust program. Perhaps this is where your green space is going to be, and you can include some trails. And so the other benefits, you have intact wildlife habitat, you have connecting corridors. Typically, you're going to have less expensive construction. Your driveways are obviously shorter. Your utility hookups, your building lot values might remain higher because you've got good screening in and around them. So if this is something you want to do as a landowner, first check for wetlands before subdividing so that you can actually maximize your developable space, and then look to how you can arrange your design in order to also maximize, I'll say, the protection of the surrounding landscape for the things that it offers as well. So now if you are in the mode for selling your land and you have wetlands on it, some people throw up their hands and they're like, I'm never going to be able to get rid of this. It's wasted land. But if you market it correctly, you can actually make the wetlands being a prime selling point as opposed to, I'll say, a warning label. So this was a listing in Lincoln, up in Lincoln Gap. And they specifically said it's classified as wetlands, but it provides a backdrop for glimpses of abundant wildlife. You may be catering to a different set of people as opposed to just the whole general public. But let me tell you, you will match the correct people to the land. This has been sold or they're under contract. I have been in continued communications with the prospective buyers. I answered all of their questions beforehand so that they know that if they move forward with the purchase, they're going to be able to do what they want with it. So tips for selling: you can increase added privacy around your home. Nobody's going to be building on this beaver pond. You do want to get a delineation ahead of time. If you're selling the land and you've got wetlands on it, think of it like how you prep that land for sellability. You get a wastewater permit ahead of time. Well, get a wetland delineation ahead of time. Identify where your building envelope is going to be. Get it approved ahead of time. I'm happy to do that with you. Secure a wetland permit if it's needed. Like sometimes there's no way to get from Lincoln Road to the upland building site without crossing the small wetland in front of the road. You can go ahead and secure that wetland permit ahead of time and basically say, yeah, I've got all the permits for you. This is the wastewater permit, and this is the wetland permit, and this is the building envelope, and it provides a level of transparency. So you want to demonstrate developability. And at the same time, these are the things you should be checking if you're going to be buying a piece of land so that you also are able to do with it what you want. So big thing is, do you have enough room? And really, what do you want to do with the land? Not just now, but also in the future. And then if you do need a wetland permit, that has to be factored in from a money standpoint as well as a time standpoint. So it comes down to, well, I want to do something. Do I need a permit? If your activity is being proposed in a class 1 or 2 wetland, or it's buffer zone, and it's not considered an allowed use, then the answer is yes. So if you're going to be doing grading, filling, ditching, dredging, if you're going to be doing removal of vegetation, so tree cutting or conversion, then you're likely going to need a permit. And then obviously any construction of infrastructure within wetland or buffer. On the no side is if it's occurring within a class 3 wetland, you don't need a state permit. You do want to check it with the local zoning level, and you may still need to get approval through the Army Corps of Engineers. Obviously, if you can avoid proposing your project within wetland and buffer, then there's nothing for me to do and you can move forward. And then if an activity qualifies as an allowed use, and I'm not going to go through those here tonight, but there are a series of allowed uses that you can find on our website, and they walk through what those are, the criteria you might have to meet. And so each one is different. And so, you know, this is a wetland up in Ripton. It's beautiful. And what we really wanted to impress is that we have a lot of resources. And so our homepage, it hosts things like the wetland screening tool that I mentioned earlier. If you have a specific inquiry, you can contact me through this inquiry form. What is your question? Where is the property that you're asking about, etc. We have all of our regulatory links in our permitting, including our allowed uses and our procedural or definition guidance documents, like what is a road? What is a ditch? What does it mean to be logging versus conversion? I know I need a permit. Which permit do I need? A general permit or an individual permit? All of this is on our homepage. And if you have any questions, reach out to me and I can steer you in the right direction. And then lastly, there's the ENB. So that's the Environmental Notice Bulletin. You can sign up for notifications. Any permit application we receive has to go on public notice. And so that's where the ENB comes in. When we receive a permit application, adjacent landowners are directly notified, but not everyone else in the town. So if you're in the town and you're interested in finding out what wetland permit applications are being received in the town of Monkton, you could sign up for the ENB and get pinged when an application in Monkton is received by our program. You can be even more specific to within a distance of your home or on specific roads. But it allows people to be able to track permitting. It also gives you an option for putting in public comments. And so Monkton is well known for its project for the amphibian crossings. And at this time of year, they're starting to move. And I'm hoping that this will work here in just a moment. And I'll flip to 2 videos that I know of that were taken of the amphibians moving through the crossing in Monkton. But that was a big undertaking with a number of partners to make this happen. In this picture, you can see it. You have the upland area over here, and then the wetland here in the foreground. And in spring, your adults, whether they're salamanders and frogs, come down from out of the upland area, typically will migrate into the wetland. And of course, when they're crossing a busy road, not only is it hazardous to them, but if you get enough of them, it can be hazardous for driving conditions too. So I'll click on the video here in a moment, but I just wanted to end with, people describe me as being friendly. I don't always deliver, the best of news, but I'm happy to work with people and get to know me. I wear a lot of hats. I have worn a lot of hats in my checkered history. And so give me an opportunity to answer your questions or give you resources. We try to help landowners do what they want to do. Sometimes that results in maybe a different design than what you wanted to do. Sometimes the answer is no. We do not support the creation of ponds within wetlands, for example. But generally, we can find some way in which to make projects happen with a few exceptions. So this is me, get to know me, and now let's see if our videos will work. Maybe, maybe not. And if not, okay, I'll try it over here. And if these don't work, I'm going to encourage you to go and check them out because they're really a lot of fun. I'm going to pause that one because it's a slightly longer one. And so all of these little tiny black dots are salamanders or another creepy crawly. And they basically recorded this over an hour and then they consolidated it into 24 seconds. So pretty cool. You can see how much movement was going on. And then this is more the real life speed of salamander. And so we've got frog, and these are our spotted salamanders. And there we have it. So now I'm gonna hopefully unshare my screen. Okay, I think that worked. In which case, I'm happy to open it up to questions. And if we need to return to a slide, then I can always reshare my screen. But I wanted to give a few minutes for questions. Caroline, you're on mute. So if you take yourself off mute, then we'll give you the honored distinction of the first question.
Hi there, how are you? Great presentation, really appreciate it. You can hear me okay now, hopefully.
Yes.
I had a question just in terms of, I think there's some interest in Monkton for having better mapping, and it sounds like an update is coming, but if we want to go a level above, are there sources of funding for that? Are there places you can get grants to do that? Is that something you'd know?
Yes and no. Right now, I would say hold off because as of August, I'll say September of this year, all of the recent mapping that has been ongoing is going to go live. And at that point, I would encourage you in the Conservation Commission or the zoning board to take a look at that comprehensive mapping and see if there's any like glaring missing areas. Conservation commissions, I think, have secured some funding, sometimes through the tiny grants to help do wetland inventories within towns. But right now, basically the wetland program has taken on that responsibility to provide you the same as or better than what you'd likely get through a consultant at this point. So patience until the end of August. In the meantime, if somebody has a specific question, I have access to sort of the behind the scenes stuff, including some of this mapping. And I am happy to take an address and do a quick screenshot and send you what I've already got, just as, you know, planning purposes, initiate conversation, be able to answer questions that might start. Well, it's not John McNerney, or is it? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm, if Monkton is considering doing something with our zoning for wetlands, do you see towns that you thought have done a particularly good job of balancing protection of wetlands with allowing development, and are there examples or places you'd recommend us looking as here's a good place to start, or somebody who's been through the process?
So the answer is yes and no. So that's part of why I've been working with the UVM students for the last 3 semesters, is to get a handle on what our town's doing. And our old document was from almost 20 years ago, and so a lot of changes have happened. What I would caution towns on is that language matters. Definitions matter. And you have to be careful not to, I'm going to say, put yourself in a corner by using absolutes. So for example, if you have a blanket statement that says all wetlands will have a 100-foot buffer, period, then there's no leeway of, well, what happens if that wetland's up against the road and the landowner would need to cross that wetland to get to the rest of that parcel? Do you have any flexibility with being able to grant permission for that? What happens if that project could be approved at the state level for a permit? Would the town honor that, or no, because of the absolute statement there's no flexibility in that? I think that there are some zoning that is important. Vernal pools especially. They're usually small, they're seasonal, and they provide a tremendous amount of function and value for our reptiles and amphibians. In which case, I would say that the state does a poor job in protecting them with only a 50-foot buffer, when they really need anywhere between a 600 to a 900-foot buffer, encapsulating the upland land around it. Now, is that realistic or practicable for towns? Maybe, maybe not. If it's an absolute 900-foot buffer, maybe not. But what if you incorporate language for some uses that might be approved, whereas others might be absolute not? So a house structure cannot be within 600 feet of the vernal pool, but if the only place a driveway can go will allow that up to a 50-foot buffer or something. So I'm not going to point you directly to any one town and say you should do what Shrewsbury's doing or Ripton's doing, but I would say that language matters, definitions matter, and having flexibility, I think, is also important. Jono?
Hi, very comprehensive presentation, and probably a lot more than I could digest. I see that it's being recorded. Is there a potential that you're going to send out to those that have been here tonight to have the recording, or how would that be something that people could get a hold of?
So I'm actually the presenter, but not the host. So the Monkton host or Ann Miller can provide that recording How that'll be distributed, I leave that up to them.
Okay,
I can certainly request a copy of that and provide a link if that's the way it's distributed through the same channels that this meeting got promoted.
that's often how it happens is they send out, a recording in case, because I came in a little bit late. That's part of the reason. The second question that I had, or just a statement rather, is you're very familiar with Porter Ball. I sit on the Bristol Conservation Commission, and there is a trail that is going through some wetland, and some neighbors have some concerns and so on. However, my other previous life was on the Middlebury Area Land Trust, and I know along the Otter Creek, they have what I call rice paddy footpath, footbridges, and they go through wet areas all the time. So I imagine that there's ways to do that, rather easily.
Like every other question, yes and no.
Okay.
I am familiar with both of those projects. I have been working with Porter Knight closely. We're going to do a site visit to actually see what's required. One of the allowed uses that I referred to is boardwalks within wetland, but they have to meet specific criteria, which also involves no cutting or removal of woody vegetation. So sometimes projects need to get creative, and every project and every site is different and needs to be evaluated by those on the ground conditions. So I will be going out and doing a site visit with Porter, and we'll be looking at those specific site conditions. But towns in general, including Monkton, are looking at ways to increase recreational opportunities, trail belt building, mountain bike building. You guys have an awesome resource with the TNC off of Rotex Road. That boardwalk actually required a permit, but at the same time, there's aspects of it that would meet an allowed use as well. So there is a video that I put together on our web page, and it's for trails specifically that walk through a variety of different structures and different environments. That would say, this is why a permit would be needed in this case. Can you see this? This is why this would actually meet an allowed use, because so many questions are coming in around trail building.
It seems like there's a lot of subtleties. My last question or observation is the house that I used to live in New Haven was built somewhere around 1980. I don't know when. There was a brook that ran through it, probably coming from Chipman Hill and Middlebury, through various farm fields, et cetera, et cetera. But they built a pond as where this brook fed into, and then they had kind of a dam on the other side. And so I kind of think that might be a yes and a no. But I always wondered how did they get the ability to do that?
Yeah, well, so previous to 1990, Vermont had no wetland rules. Basically, you could do whatever you wanted in wetlands. You could fill them in and build on top of them. You could convert them into agriculture. You could do whatever you wanted. No rules. 1990, we had our initial rules, but only for those wetlands that were mapped. Going back to the presentation, with follow-up studies, some research studies, based on the type of wetland that was out there, they weren't mapped. You couldn't see the ground for the trees. Like 49% of our forested wetlands in Vermont were never picked up. So in 2010, Vermont legislative body finally said, oh, wait, we get it. The maps are not good. And we said, you're right, they're not good. And that's where the presumptions came in. That talks about wetlands next to our rivers and streams, those vernal pools that have never been picked up because they're so small. Ponds. Yes, that was a common practice. And any in-stream or on-stream pond today, provided that it had been built not in violation, so your 1980 example, there was no wetland rules, it was built, it can be maintained. However, most on-stream ponds, sometimes they get flooded out and the dam breaks and it gets washed. We saw that a lot with Irene. they will not be reapproved for the reconstruction of, not approved from the wetlands program if a wetland's involved, and not approved by the stream alteration engineers or the rivers program because of the water quality issues, the sedimentation, the impact to habitat downstream. And basically our policy, so to speak, is we're not approving pond creation in wetlands. Nobody typically needs a pond as a project purpose in a specific location. And so it comes back to our avoidance and minimization. And so while ponds are pretty, they're not great for wetlands and functions and values. So Stephen.
There we go. So I would describe myself as a new member on the Monkton Development Review Board. And at least two of the recent projects that we've looked at have had third-party engineers come out and survey for wetlands. There's certainly wetlands that don't show up on your ANR atlas. So I'm sort of like, are these class 3 wetlands that they're pulling up, or is this jurisdictional wetlands that you were talking about? And if you could just fill me in just a little bit.
So once again, the answer is yes and no. So a consultant or an engineer with wetland delineation background goes out in the field, and what they're looking for is that trifecta of where your hydrology, your wetland soils, and the dominance of wetland plants exist. And then they start working back away from that until one of those criteria drops out. I no longer have hydric soils, or I'm no longer having a dominance of wetland vegetation. At that point, that's where they're putting their flag and says, this is where the wetland is and where the wetland is not, right? Depending on how big that wetland ends up being, whether it's mapped or not, if it's over a half acre in size, you assume that it's class 2. If it contains a vernal pool, assume that it's class 2. If it's adjacent to any stream or other surface waters, assume that it's class 2. And most of the time, if a consultant is coming out, I end up working with consultants, and I will go out and I'll do a site visit with them to review their flags. And when I do that, what I'm really doing is providing transparency and confirmation that if you needed to come in for a permit, that I agree to where those wetland lines are, or if you don't need a permit, they can send me site plans and I can say, yes, I agree that this is where the wetland is, and that the project proposed is outside of those wetlands and buffers, doesn't require a wetland permit. So it provides a check and balance so that the landowner knows, kind of like getting a certification on your wastewater permit, that it's been reviewed by the state, it's been agreed by the state, we're all on the same page. And at the same time, I provide confirmation of classification and jurisdiction.
Great. And just sort of a quick follow-up, do the maps that that engineer generates, does that sort of work back into the updated wetlands maps that you guys are going to provide later in the summer?
Yes and no. You're starting to see a pattern here. If they come in for a permit and that wetland is not mapped, then they provide us with the shape files that they're collecting in the field. And then yes, that gets updated on our map. But if they don't need a permit, then we never get the shape files. I might still have the site plans in a project folder, and therefore I've got that, that star. I also work with town clerks and zoning administrators where they will send me the site plans that they've received and said, hey, Zap, do you have any red flags or concerns? And I'll do a desktop review and I'll come back and say, well, hey, Stephen, when was this delineation done? Or was this line taken right off of the ANR Atlas? Because I know for sure that this isn't right. Or maybe there's nothing at all, and I do a desktop review and I say, I'm a little hesitant about this area over here. I'm seeing a lot of red flags. This is what I'm seeing. I think this property needs a delineation, or I could come out and just do a site visit to see if there's any confirmation of potential issues. So I do that with zoning boards, or planning commissions. So, use me as a resource that way if you think it would be useful.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And the Monkton host doesn't actually have a name, and we weren't properly introduced. So, hi.
Yeah, Jamie Schulte. I just wanted to comment that we will post the recording on the Monkton website, monktonvt.com, under the boards and committees and Conservation Commission page. And I think this kind of a presentation has a pretty good shelf life, of some number of years, even if state rules or town zoning changes a bit. So we'll keep it up there for quite a long time.
Great. And once I'm done with the UVM study, and I actually have a compilation of all of the towns, and we've populated that Excel spreadsheet, and we've put together that map, we are going to be opening it and presenting it to the public. I will make sure that Conservation Commission folks know about it. We're going to try and do some media around it, because there's a lot of questions around zoning and zoning updates. So that's why we started this 1.5 years ago with students to help put together the resource, because it's very time intensive, as they would attest to. Okay, well, we're at about 6:35. We were scheduled basically for an hour, 5:30 to 6:30. If there's any last questions, Susanna, I saw you say something, but you might still be on mute.
I'm not on mute, but I thought it was from 6:30 to 7:30, so I wondered why you had started. I had the wrong.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Susan, please.
So I live on a pond in Starksboro on Baldwin Pond, and I have a neighbor who also lives on the pond, and they have a dam, and the dam has boards in it, and there's like 3 levels to the dam, and I just wonder, are they in charge of, they can do whatever they want with those boards, or is there any state regulations? It makes the pond go up and down whenever they want. Does that matter? Is there any, any sort of laws about that, rules or anything?
So yes and no. It really depends on the ownership of the pond, whether it's wholly privately owned, is it only owned by one person as opposed to many, the size of the pond, the type of dam it is, whether that dam is regulated under dam safety rules. So there's a lot of nuances around dams and water levels. So if you wanted to send me, a 911 address or a snapshot of the area, I can certainly do a desktop review and maybe answer your question more specifically.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Yeah.
Okay. So my email address, it's not on the screen now, but it's my first name, Zapata.courage, my last name, at Vermont, all spelled out, .gov, short for government. So Zapata.courage at Vermont.gov.
Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more raised hands. I'm seeing some smiles, so hopefully that means you enjoyed my presentation, and I will let you folks go. But if there are any follow-up questions after this, I know a number of you have my contact information, and please do reach out, ask questions, and we'll keep the conversation happening.
Thank you, Zapata. I really appreciate you spending time with us.
Oh, you're
Thanks a
welcome.
lot.
Happy spring, and go out and visit some vernal pools.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Zapata. That was excellent. Very good.
I appreciate the invitation, Anne. Take care and stay in touch. Bye, everyone.
Bye.